So today I'm excited to be here with author and HSP mentor William Allen. William is an author with a writer's heart and a researcher's mind. After getting a degree in psychology with an eye on doing psychology research, he recalibrated for a career in information technology. He found himself in a 30-year career as an information technology manager at Wells Fargo Bank, who enjoyed managing highly intelligent staff, many of whom were also highly sensitive. He retired early from his corporate job to start his hypno coaching and neurofeedback brain training business, Brain Pilots, in Bend, Oregon. And in late 2016, William began his blog, The Sensitive Man, about his experiences as a highly sensitive man. This blog became the genesis of his first book, Confessions of a Sensitive Man, and his new book on being a sensitive man is the follow-up book, which focuses on how to live in the world as a sensitive man. He feels that HSP males need to take their keen insights and intuition and make them public. He would like to shed more light on highly sensitive males and the much needed role they play in our society. So welcome, William. So excited to be here with you today.
Thanks, April. Thanks for having me.
Oh, of course. You ready to dive into some questions?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, great. So if we could start off by telling folks, what is high sensitivity and how do you know if you, your child, or a loved one is highly sensitive?
Well, high sensitivity is, technically it's called sensory processing sensitivity. It is a temperament trait, largely genetic, that about 20 to 30%, depending on the numbers or who you're looking at, of the world's population has this trait. So it's a large number of people, but in terms of percentages of the whole total population, it's not nearly a majority. But nevertheless, it's a trait that has some very specific characteristics, and it's being sort of written about en masse now. I mean, when I started writing my blog about 6 or 7 years ago, there were a few people writing it. Now everybody's got their hands writing things on it. And I like to stick with Elaine Aron, Dr. Elaine Aron, who is our sort of benefactor here. She's the one who labeled the trait, sort of put it all together. It's been something that's been with the human population forever, but it's something that she finally put a name to and some parameters around. And what he uses to describe this trait is the acronym DOES, D-O-E-S, and that stands for depth of processing. This is one of the things that highly sensitive people do quite well. It's deep thinking, deep processing. We're not shallow thinkers. We're not superficial. We're very deep thinkers on how we process the world around us. The second characteristic is the tendency towards overstimulation and overwhelm, which many of us experience. And there's some good reasons for that. I mean, we process a lot of data. We take in a lot of data. We're taking a lot of things and trying to incorporate that in. So it's not surprising that we have this characteristic of being overstimulated from time to time. The E stands for emotional reactivity or emotions, deep emotion processing. And we do that as well. This deep emotion processing that we do is very much like our deep thinking. It's deep diving. Everything about us is very deep, not so superficial at all. And the other side of that letter E is also that we're very empathetic individuals. We care about people around us. We sense things about other people around us. And I don't think there's anything really magical about that. It's because I think we have this awareness of sometimes cues that are physical, sometimes they're non-physical, but we pick up things because of our innate awareness of different things that are going on in the environment. And then finally, the letter S stands for sensing the subtle, picking up nuanced information in the environment, which is something we are really good at, and I think it's one of our greatest attributes. And that's being able to differentiate ourselves in many ways from other people who kind of let things blow by. We kind of have this attention to detail that gives us some insights, that gives us some abilities to notice when things are changing and other people are not. Kind of that canary in the coal mine uh, part that I think is attributable to highly sensitive people a lot. Um, so, if you to your second part of your question, how do you know and how do you find out about it? Really, the gold standard is a test that Dr. Aaron has formed. It's a self-study type survey on hsperson.com. In fact, there are three tests out there. One is for adults, one is for children. You can take that for a child to see if they're too young to be able to take a test like that. It's very simple and easy to do, and it's self-grading, so you know right away, within 15, 20 minutes of taking the test, you got your answer as to whether you fall in this category or not.
Yeah, that's great, Bill. I put the link in the chat, which is
Okay.
that's all three of the tests, the HSP adult test, the HSP child, and also the high sensation seeking test. So folks are interested. I'm wondering, Bill, if you could tell us a little bit more about your own story about discovering your sensitivity.
Well, I'm 67 years old, so I'm going to date myself right away. But I was born in the mid 50s, and really at that time there really wasn't a lot of information about sensitivity and how it relates to children, how it relates to individuals. But I always knew that there was something different about me relative to other people that I knew. I was more emotional, um, and I heard more often than not the admonishment, "You're too sensitive. You're too emotional." And so for me, unfortunately, growing up, the word sensitive had all of these pejorative connotations to them. So I eventually, as I got older, into adolescence, and I grew up in a very traditional part of the United States. I grew up in South Carolina, and during that time period, boys were very much conditioned to follow the boy code, which eventually became the man code. Being sensitive was not something that a good man would be, right? Based on those definitions. Um, and so I think myself, I tried to kind of suppress these traits as I grew up, and I didn't really embrace them, although you can't really walk away from them. They're always going to be there. But I think I wouldn't acknowledge them publicly, and certainly around my male peers and so forth. And it wasn't until I was almost 50 years old that I picked up Elaine's book. I read it, and it was about 2005 or so. I read the book, and it checked all the boxes. I said, "Yeah, that's me, that's me, that's me," but I still couldn't get past that filter that says, "But that's not what a man is supposed to be." That's more like, and believe me, this is from the definitions I had been taught. This is what women are supposed to be, but men are not supposed to be this way. So I had this internal struggle that I had for about 10 years. I mean, I was wrestling with this, and I was still in corporate work then. In about 2010, I retired, and then I started writing the blog shortly after that. I had a business and so forth, as you mentioned. It was at that point that I started to get my hands around this. And as I wrote and explored the trait and educated myself about the trait, I began to accept it. So when I wrote the book in 2019, that was kind of my coming out and saying to the world, "Hey, look, I'm going to put this out there and take my chances and see what happens, because this is who I am, and I want to be who I am."
Yeah, that's amazing. You talked about the need to suppress your sensitivity, and it took a really long time to embrace it. Would you say that that's part of the different experience highly sensitive men have with the trait versus women, or maybe even non-binary folks?
I absolutely think so. In fact, I really don't know of anything. I haven't seen any research. I'm not sure that there's anything that differentiates how um, people experience a different gender, how they experience the sensitive trait. So I'm going to assume at this point that we all experience it very similarly. I think on the back end, for men, I mean, I like to look at it like the trait is kind of a prism that sits out in front of us. The data that comes in is how we get fed this who we are, our personality, etc., is a secondary processing on that information. But there are also these little pockets of what you call modules or whatever, or filters that we have that also can override some of these things. And I think that's what happens for a lot of men, especially men of my age, possibly men of Gen X. And I see less and less of that with millennials. I see less and less of that with Gen Z, but I see a lot of it with my generation, which is this sort of override. You can't be that. That's not what a man is supposed to be. And there's that push pull, because a lot of that filter was placed there with shame and guilt that we grew up with. If you didn't conform, you were shamed. You were made to feel like you were not a man. And so those are some of the internal conflicts. And I think that affects the expression of the trait, not the receiving of the information or how it gets internalized, but how it shows outwardly. You don't show your emotions. You don't do that. So that takes some learning to get to that point where you can say, look, I want to be authentic. I want to be me, and allow that to happen.
Yeah, you make such a good point that the trait is there, right? Whether you're embracing it and able to internalize it or not, it's happening. You're receiving that information, you're doing that deep processing that your brain is wired to do. Yeah, I guess it can be really challenging, to accept those parts of yourself and to work with them. So I'm curious, what other problem, you talked about the internal dialogue and that process, but what other struggles or problems do highly sensitive men deal with when you have this trait?
Well, I think one of the things too is this going back to this being authentic to yourself. If you've been living your whole life as a traditional masculine male based on those constructs that we have in our society about that, then you're not actually living who you are. So what you're doing is you're not being authentic to yourself. You're not being who you really are. You're not allowing yourself to express yourself the way that you can be. So that's a struggle for men too. And I think a lot of times men will say, well, I kind of feel like a hybrid. I feel like there's a lot of feminine energy in me, and I don't know what to do with that. The masculine is in conflict with the feminine side of me, and so forth. And the way I look at that really truly is both masculine and feminine constructs that we have. And I don't want to get philosophizing on another topic, but the idea is that those are both human traits, and we've just labeled them into buckets. I mean, we all have masculine and feminine characteristics, what we call masculine and feminine. I like to think of them as human. So being a hybrid is really truly just being a human being, a true authentic human being. A lot of men, I think, struggle with that, especially with the kind of messaging that men get about how they're supposed to be and so forth and so on. It reminds me of something that just flashed into my head. I don't know if you remember, a few years ago there was a Gillette commercial about something that came out, and they were talking, it somehow came out about masculinity. I can't remember all the details to it, but it just hit the fan because of that, because it was bucking up against that ideal masculine ideals and constructs that we have. And I think that is indicative of the kind of struggles a lot of times I think the HSP male has and struggles with.
Yeah, it's such an internal battle, and it reminds me just how men struggle to be full humans, right? You have to disavow so much of yourself. And if you're a highly sensitive male, potentially even more so, especially as you're so attuned and intuitive and emotional, there's so much that you're needing to suppress or just detach from. I'm wondering if you could speak to how we can redefine what masculinity is, especially with so much of this toxic masculinity that men face, especially highly sensitive men face.
Well, I think one of the things we have to do, especially when we talk about toxic masculinity, and it has a lot of different names, patriarchy or hegemonic masculinity, is in order to reach men, they have to get past the point that you're not saying that if you're masculine you're toxic, or if you're masculine you're a patriarch, or you're any of these other things that they're assuming are just kind of pejorative terms for men. That's not it at all. This toxic masculinity is a corruption of what really masculinity should be. And I think for highly sensitive men, we can be great models if we start bringing more highly sensitive men sort of online, using a computer term, uh, to this trait so that they can be comfortable with it, they can embrace the trait, and then they can actually model what empathy might look like. They can model what kindness looks like. They can model what nurturing and using intuition as well as using logic to solve problems. And to be cautious and thoughtful. Those are things that, to me, are sorely lacking right now in our world. We're pressing so much on this whole idea of domination and subjugation and so forth and so on that manifests itself in wars and climate change and all kinds of things that I think are directly related to that masculine model. It is a construct. It is not the way men inherently are. I don't believe that. And, I really think that highly sensitive men can really stand out and model it and show it. Whether you do it locally, whether you do it on your town, your community, your family, or whether you do it nationally or statewide or internationally, whatever the case, wherever you're comfortable with. I think that's the kind of things that highly sensitive men can really contribute to kind of unwinding this toxic masculinity.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, just think of all the possibilities for everyone, right? If highly sensitive men can be their full selves. I love how you talked about balancing intuition and logic, making room for all the different strengths, right? Not just the stereotypically masculine ones, but like there's so much more to masculinity than what we pigeonhole men to be. So yeah, it just I makes me think about we've talked about this a little bit, but what's the evolutionary purpose of high sensitivity? Because I see there's more to it, right, than just maybe deep thinking or deep emotions. There's so much more to having this trait. I'm wondering if you could talk about that deeper purpose.
Well, certainly, I think our natural tendencies, and if you let me back up a second here, and let's talk about sensitivity as a spectrum, because there's not just highly sensitive people, and the rest of the world falls off somewhere. Sensitivity is a spectrum, and there are those people on the other end, opposite from highly sensitive people, who are, and I hate putting it this, I don't want to make it sound like they're insensitive human beings, but they are less sensitive to environmental changes. That's really what this is all about. It isn't about caring or loving or anything else. And everybody on the lower end isn't necessarily a narcissist, right? So the idea is, but those people are more likely to go out and take risks, take chances, do things that may be sort of caution to the wind, but may in fact advance culture as a result of that. So what we need is highly sensitive people. This is our evolutionary calling, I think, is to serve as that balance point, that cautionary point, that, as like Dr. Aaron says, the priestly advisors, the wise counselors, those people who can say, you know what, maybe we don't want to drive the bus off the cliff. Maybe there's another way down the cliff besides driving it over the top. So it's that kind of balance point that highly sensitive people offer. That is a critical part. And I think for so long, highly sensitive people, mainly I think because maybe we just didn't know what to call this and to how to wrap our hands around it. Now that we have it, it's kind of a rallying call for highly sensitive people to kind of, I don't know, mobilize a bit, start being ourselves, doing the role that we were designed to do by nature, which is to introduce that caution and that thoughtfulness.
Yeah, it's so true. I think we forget that we have that purpose. We get so swept up in the overwhelm and trying to keep up and do what everyone else is doing, forgetting that we have a specific purpose. That's why this temperament trait that's how it's survived over the years. Elaine talks about that a lot. Like, this trait survived for a reason. It has a purpose. And yeah, we do need that balance, that counterpoint, that the people that are thinking about how can we do things in a smarter way that's good for everybody. Can we zoom in a little bit further and talk about, so we talked about the HSP trait as a whole and the value of that, but what about for HSP men? What's the value they bring, and what's the need we have for HSP men in today's world?
I think that, again, for HSP men, there needs to be particularly a counterbalance to the kind of masculinity that we have seen for so long. Um, I don't think we have to see ourselves as sort of off to the side, not necessarily out in the center stage. I think we can be. I think we need to encourage HSP leaders to rise up, and especially in leadership positions, whether it's in the boardroom or whether it's in the White House. It's the idea that we need that kind of thoughtfulness in leadership positions. So I think those are some of the values. All of these traits, which we share equally between male and female, is this idea that we have empathy, that we're nurturing, and that we have this intuitive sense about us that will is what we sorely need in the world right now. For me right now, I look at this. I just recently had my first grandson was born in April, and I'm pretty sure he's going to wind up being an HSP male. His mom is, and my son is. So I think about the world he's going to inherit from us, and this is one of the things I think that I'm so encouraged by seeing millennial HSP males and Gen Z HSP males taking the lead on this. They understand, and I think all millennials and all Gen Zs do as well, this is their world. They're going to be here 50 years from now. I'm not. So what are we going to leave behind? And I think as older HSP males, it is our job and responsibility to model this for younger HSP males and for younger men generally, and share whatever wisdom that we have gathered over the years with them, so that we can sort of direct a kind of conscious effort to shift the focus more towards something that's balanced and not imbalanced the way it is right now.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That we can see what's needed. We know what's needed to create that balance, that thoughtfulness in society. And there's a lot of things that we can do that I think we often limit ourselves to because we're overwhelmed, that we're really stressed out. So I'm wondering, what can men specifically do to live more balanced life, to open up that space to be more in a contributing space, right? Where they're feeling less stress, less anxiety, less overwhelm, and more access to intuition and
Right.
insight.
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the first things I think for any male who suspects that they're highly sensitive, and it's something I think that you probably have known your entire life, you just don't know how to define it or how to put a handle around it, is to get as educated as you can about the trait. I think that that's a good place to sort of ground you going forward. If you don't understand the trait, it's much easier to get off the track and start getting discouraged or feel like you can't deal with some of the challenges that the trait does provide us. But once that education is there and you get really grounded and you start to embrace the trait, and this is where self-love can start kicking in, right? Where you start loving yourself for being this person. You've been told this is who you are your whole life. This is what you're supposed to be. And now you're finding out who you really are, your authentic, true self. So that's very important, I think, for men to be able to do that. Learn some coping skills, too, about some of the things like overwhelm. We can, a lot of times, I think people that are highly sensitive who get overwhelmed just kind of crash and burn when it happens. There's ways of knowing when it's coming on. There's ways of averting it or at least settling into it. These coping skills are really important to sort of, like I said, match up against the challenges that highly sensitive people often have. I mean, with high emotion and deep thinking, you combine those things, sometimes it can be extremely overwhelming when you're trying to deal with this all by yourself. So learn those coping skills that are easily available. Things like mindfulness, meditation, doing something like getting out in nature, taking a hike, doing Tai Chi, yoga, whatever it is that you can distract yourself and get into that calm spot. Another thing that Dr. Aaron talks about a lot too is just learning how to regulate your emotions. And I kind of consider that like throttling your emotions, not suppressing them. That's not the idea here. We don't want to suppress them. We just want to regulate when it's appropriate, when it's not appropriate. And those are kind of things that give you some control back, because a lot of times it's riding that wave, and you can ride the wave like a surfer does, or you can crash and drown, and that's what unfortunately some people wind up doing is they take that route. Learning to control that, learning to throttle it, is a good way of being able to deal with that kind of and helping create that balance. Um, and I think overall, teaching yourself resilience. There's lots of ways of doing that. Again, I did brain training. I did neurofeedback brain training, which I thought was really good. But there's a lot of really good brain training classes out there, and I think Julie Bielen has a whole bucket load of classes that she's done on brain training, which I think are excellent to learn how to do that. And that idea is to build this resilience, this ability to spring back. You're not going to stop the emotions. You're not going to stop sometimes the overwhelm. But the idea is how quickly can you recover and come back and be focused and ready to go again. So that's that resilience. So these are all strategies for managing your sensitivity. It's like wielding a fire hose. It can be very useful if you know what you're doing and how to wield it, but if you let it go, it flaps all over the place and it's dangerous to you and everybody else. So I think it's really just a matter of managing this and learning how to manage it with these coping skills.
Yeah, it's true. We're never going to get rid of our reactivity, our strong emotions, but I like how you talked about titrating, essentially, right? You're letting some of the emotion come out in a more controlled way, so you're not completely flooded and overtaken by your emotions, so they're not in control of you. And definitely it's not about what you're doing. It's not like there's one specific way to find that sense of regulation and calm. It's what resonates for you. That's the
Absolutely.
beauty. We can do whatever we find exciting or inspiring or grounding. It could be going into nature. It could be, I don't know, doing Tai Chi or journaling or dancing or creating art. There's so many things. It's endless. That's the beauty of it. We're all different and we can find what works for us.
And I think one of the things that's nice about this too, April, is that highly sensitive people are usually very creative,
That's it.
and I think you can mix and match, put things together,
Yeah.
whatever, as you said, resonates with you, because you want it to be something that's going to be meaningful for you.
Exactly. And so there's lots of, getting to know yourself so you can embrace the trait. Like, what do I need for me? What helps me feel soothed and focused? Yeah, the beauty of that.
Yeah.
So I'm curious for folks and I would love to know in the chat, who in your life is a highly sensitive male? Is it a client? Is it a child or a brother or a husband, a parent? I know, William, you mentioned you have a highly sensitive son and potentially a grandson now at this point. So if anyone's open to sharing, I'd love to know who's in your life that's a highly sensitive male. And William, for you, what's the best way that folks can support those highly sensitive men in their life? Oh, and someone say, oh, and if you are a highly sensitive male, of course. Um, so yeah, I'm curious, how can folks support the highly sensitive males in their life, whether they're children, brothers, siblings, adults, spouses?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
I I wrote a little piece for Highly Sensitive Refuge about 2 years ago, and it was written in a sort of one of those list type articles about supporting highly sensitive boys, and I think it applies equally well with highly sensitive men. So let me just kind of go over these points real quick, and I'll answer any questions or anything that come from that. One of the things, especially with highly sensitive boys, is don't try to normalize them. Don't try to make them fit the boy mold. They are who they are, uh, and that's who they're supposed to be. So don't try to wedge them into being something they're not. I kind of made that mistake with my son. I wanted him to play basketball. He's tall, but he wanted to play music, and he ultimately that's what he did. And I learned my lesson from that is trying to make him into what I was wanting him to be and not listening to him. And they'll tell you what they want and what they need. You just need to pay attention and listen. Certainly, we talked about emotional regulation. If you can teach that to your child or even to your partner or your friend or your other highly sensitive male in your life, work with them and trying to learn how to regulate their emotions. Don't be just critical of the fact that they do have these emotional ups and downs. A lot of times people, say, "Oh, you're just too moody." Well, the idea is, well, they don't understand what's going on inside of you, and so if you can learn to teach them how to emotionally regulate themselves, it'll go a long way to helping them out throughout their lives. Another thing I would say is, especially for boys, is do gentle challenges. Make sure that they're learning about expanding their comfort zone. I'm not an advocate of taking them out and throwing them in the deep end of the pool, but I think if you get them down towards the end where it's deep, gradually you teach them it's okay to learn new things. It's okay to do things that are challenging and maybe a little scary at first. But those things will pay off big dividends later on in life. And I think it's true for if you have highly sensitive men who are stuck in a comfort zone kind of rut. Celebrate their differences. That's another big thing I think it's important, is to make sure everybody is understanding that the fact that they are different is a good thing, and it makes them unique. And that also kind of dives into the next one, which is understanding their unique gifts. That's like I said about my son. Pay attention. Highly sensitive people do have unique gifts, and so need to pay attention to that. One of the key things I think is being emotionally supportive and nurturing. It's very true for children growing up in in an environment. Highly sensitive people do better, way better, in an environment where it's supporting and nurturing. If you're with a highly sensitive partner, male or female, it's always good to be doing that with them, is being supportive as much as you can. As for men or boys, don't question their masculinity. You don't say, if you're not doing this, you're not a man. I heard that too many times, and it really caused a lot of self-doubt with me. That was one of the big things for me. So don't question their masculinity. Realize there's different ways to be a man. There's different ways to express masculinity. Don't label them as having a disorder. That's the other thing. Understand the trait is not a disorder. It is a normal, as we say, nature baked in kind of trait, and it's designed to be that way. And lastly, make sure you give them space. They got to have space, and understand that's not them being antisocial. It's the idea that they need that downtime. They need space by themselves. So those are the ways I would say going about supporting boys and men together.
I think it's beautiful. It's accepting them as they are in their own version of masculinity, and highlighting their gifts, their strengths. Those differences are not, like as you said, they're not a negative. They're not something you have to get rid of or change about yourself. They're just different, and helping them see that there are gifts and there's purpose in those differences, and just really meeting them where they are, right? Listening to how they're dealing
Exactly.
emotionally, supporting that process, not trying to make those emotions smaller or react in any different way, but just saying, okay, I see you, I appreciate you. And I love how you said, and then challenge them slowly to maybe expand themselves. Because a lot of times HSP kiddos, they suffer a lot with anxiety, especially if you're a highly sensitive male or highly sensitive boy. You're already feeling different. Like you said, that from a young age, that you're different, that you're sensitive, even if you don't have the language for it. But helping them realize they can step into themselves and grow, and it's really beautiful. Yeah. A lot of folks here are saying like they have highly sensitive sons, or they were that highly sensitive boy, or they're working with highly sensitive clients. So I think this can apply, as you said, to any conversation or any relationship.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
I think it applies equally too, and many of the items there on anyone who's highly sensitive, regardless of
Yeah,
where they
absolutely.
fall.
And would you say these are the same practices that would help that highly sensitive young boy feel confident and accepting of their trait? Or would you add anything
Absolutely.
else? Yeah.
Absolutely. Because, like you said, you're reinforcing the idea that they're a unique individual, that
Yeah.
they have, talents and skills and so forth. And then you take this thing about the masculinity question, take it out of the conversation, and say you are who you are, And I like to again stress the emphasis on being a human being first. Everything else takes care of itself in its own way.
I love that. That's right. We're all just humans.
We're
And,
humans, yeah.
and we all have a purpose to be here. And if we bring all of our gifts together, we could be in a really incredible space instead of
Exactly.
trying to make everyone the same. Like if we could just honor, oh, there are advantages to having different temperaments.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And then that intersection of having that temperament with something else, like a different gender or a different background, there's even more benefit when we can bring that
There's
together.
a million billion ways to slice the human race up into
That's
different
right.
individual characteristics and so forth, and we're all unique and beautiful. So I just think that being human should be something we all strive for.
Yeah, absolutely. So if folks want to dive into this topic more, what resources do you have available?
The best way to get in touch with me or find out about my blog or the books or anything else is to go to my website. It's thesensitiveman.com. And it's got links to the books, it's got links to the blog. And I also want to mention, for those who might be interested, those males out there that might be interested, I do have an HSP men's group that meets online. There's no cost, there's no obligation. Come and go as you want. We have sometimes we have speakers, sometimes we have but almost every time we have little breakout rooms. We have topics, and it's a small gathering of men in each room, and you're free to go from room to room. Even have a room where there's nothing in it. You can just go sit if you want to, and decompress. But anyway, if you're interested in that or want to get some more information about it, they can contact me through the website.
Great. And you have a group coming up soon, is that
On
correct?
Thursday, yeah, I'm actually going to have. I'm going to have to do a plug here for him. Will Harper, who has done all the sensitive movies, the director, and Tracy Cooper's being one of the producers, great HSP advocate, a male advocate. Um, they've got an upcoming movie called Sensitive Man Rising. That's in the sort of pre-production stage right now. Hopefully, going to come out sometime soon, and it'll be a game changer, I think, for a lot of highly sensitive men to be able to see something visual about the trait.
Yeah, that's going to be incredible. I know the original sensitive film changed so much for so many people, and it was a conversation starter they could share with loved ones or colleagues, and just to put the words to your experience in a more visual and cohesive way. So yeah, it's going to be such an important resource. So I want to give folks time to ask questions. So we have
Sure.
about 20 minutes left. I know we have one question so far. If you have questions for William on anything we talked about so far or something we didn't cover in relation to highly sensitive men or boys, go ahead and put that in the Q&A box. You should find that at the bottom of your screen. And if you're having trouble with the Q&A box, go ahead and put it in the chat. So our first question, William, is could you suggest ideas to present the idea of HSP to those that say you're too sensitive? So someone's already putting up a wall, oh, you're too sensitive. They've already are starting to judge you for having this trait. Is there any way that you could talk to them about being an HSP? Do you have any ideas about that?
Yeah, it's interesting, and I tell you what, this men's group, I've learned a lot in that. Just talking to some of the men that are there, very often when you're talking about the term sensitive, you automatically conjure up all kinds of connotations for people, and sometimes you get pushback right away just because of the term sensitive. So a lot of times, what I try to do is frame it in a little different way. Depends on the individual. If I'm talking to another male, I might take a kind of a nuts and bolts approach to it and describe sensitivity, like, for example, like Dr. Tracy Cooper does, that it's like a tool. It's a very sensitive tool. Is the kind of thing that you're looking for precision to measure something. It might have parameters it has to operate within, like say it can't operate in too cold or too hot. But the point is, it's the best tool for using for getting a precise measurement of something. And highly sensitive people, I like to think of as specialist humans that have this ability to sort of gauge things in the environment. So to your question, I would say try to take, depending on the individual, if they're kind of, let's say, a traditional male and they would appreciate understanding something in kind of a nuts and bolts kind of way, then present it that way. Sometimes you have to go around in a less direct manner to get to the point about it. But the idea is what you want to do is get them to that point when they go, oh, my brother's like that, or my dad is like that, or my cousin's like that. Because everybody knows at least one person in their life, and probably more, that are highly sensitive. So when you do that, you've created that common bind between the two of you, and then you can start deep diving a little bit more and a little bit more and feed them as you go along. The idea here is that we've got a lot of work to do in messaging and how we get the message across to people. But I say, just like you said earlier, meet them where they're at. Meet them where they're at. Don't try to just go in and say, "Wow, this is high. This is my high sensitivity." Try to find that common ground with them. Like I said, it usually is a relative or somebody they know, and then explain the trait to them. And I certainly would be selling the positive sides to this trait.
Yeah, I think Elaine talks about that too. Don't use it as an excuse. Don't lead with the negatives because folks are already zooming in on that anyway. It's we want to help them understand the benefits, the gifts, the positives of having this trait because there's so many parts of being a sensitive person that people don't put together, like how you're so empathetic and you can always pick up on their needs and how you come up with ideas and solutions and can see ahead to a problem. There's so many parts of this trait and this how our brain works that people don't understand. I like what you said, like find language that fits the person or your audience, that they can understand, that they can link that to someone they know or their own experience. Yeah, I think metaphor can be really helpful in that way, like
That's
help them translate it.
that is a perfect example. That's our language is metaphors,
Yeah.
and we ought to be really good at this. And because it's a creative way of speaking, so yes, use metaphors. Definitely do that. The toolbox one is a good one, or the tool is a good one, and there's so many others you can come up with naturally. Again, you can craft the message to the individual, so use the metaphor that's appropriate for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And then they can kind of enter in, you can find a way for them to enter into your world and appreciate where you're coming from. Yeah.
Yeah.
Another question that we had, is there a connection that you've seen between HSP males and depression? So have you seen a correlation between those two in your work with men?
I yes, in some ways yes, and I know that there are highly sensitive people tend to um, be more depressed and more anxious than most individuals. Um, and I think it's partly attributable to, well, could be largely because of the environment they were raised in. It could have been a bad start to the way they see themselves, and it goes through and carries on through life. But a lot of it might be because they don't know how to cope with the emotionality sometimes. They don't know how to cope with the overwhelm and the overstimulation. That can be very depressing. Let's take a real world example. You work in an environment where it's a big cubicle farm. It's a lot of noise. It's crazy and chaotic, and you can't do the work that you want to do. You don't know how to cope with it. You don't know how to express that to your boss. So what happens is you start beating yourself up. I don't fit here. I'm not happy, and then you become depressed or anxious. And a lot of that is understanding who you are, where you are, how your brain works, and why your brain won't work well in that kind of environment. Because environment is everything to HSPs. Which of course goes back to the environmental sensitivity theory, which was this loops up underneath, is how do we react to the environment? Well, we're at the highest end in terms of environmental sensitivity. So if you're in a bad environment, wherever it is, you're going to be tendency is to go that direction into anxiety or depression or both.
Yeah, it's true. I don't think we put enough stock in how much we're impacted by our environments, how sensitive we are to all that noise and the social cues and the sensory cues that are happening. And a lot of these, a lot of workplaces or even public spaces are overstimulating to everyone. So
Yes.
especially to the HSP who's more attuned. And if you're a highly sensitive male and you don't realize what's happening, you think, oh, I can't do this. I hear this all the time from clients who say like, oh, I'm not fit for society. Um, because they feel like they don't fit anywhere, that they can't function anywhere. But it's a matter of finding the right environment. And I've seen clients who were very, very depressed, switch jobs, and immediately it's like a cloud lifted. Like all of a
Exactly.
sudden, it's incredible. Like all of a sudden they're in a space that's supportive and they can exercise those strengths that they have inside of them.
Yeah, and I think this is really something that we need to see more of, and that is career coaching for HSPs, helping them find the right environment to work in. Is like I said, is really something that's critical, and I think that helps them assimilate into the larger society because they found their home, a place to be, like right now, a lot of HSPs, and I know a few from the men's call that had done careers that there was an expectation of somebody else. It wasn't what they wanted. So again, yeah,
We have a comment here from Linda saying, "Wow, thank you, Bill. You just described my experience working in an open office environment for 16 plus years and how draining that was for me and how insufficient I felt because I could tell that I was so drained by it when others weren't." Right? You start to compare yourself to
right.
others.
Well, here's the funny thing about what you just mentioned a minute ago. This is the canary in the coal mine scenario. HSPs, if they really work managers, design engineers who build office space should really get a group of HSPs together to talk about the best way to design an environment. We are usually the first ones impacted by bad environments like that. And those open cubicle environments, I don't know who thought of those, but it's kind of an insane way to do work. The idea, I think, was that people are closer together, they'll cooperate and work and exchange ideas and so forth. But it turns out to be nothing but a cluster of noise and everything else. So, and HSPs
Yeah.
know that. That's why we don't work in places like that. It's not good
They
for work.
we do. We know. We like you said, we're the canary in the coal mine. We know when something needs to be changed. Yeah. We
Yeah.
have a couple more questions. One question is from someone who's a therapist. I think it's just a general question. Are you aware of HSP therapists in England or elsewhere? Yes, I am. I will put the link to my Facebook group in the chat because there are a lot of therapists there from England, UK, all around Europe. So I'll link that in. And for you, Bill, a question. So if you have a highly sensitive male in your life who may be offended or resistant to the term sensitive, um, how do you start a conversation about sensitivity with that male? Like if they're resistant to the
Yeah.
language or the term.
And I understand that completely because I kind of would have come from that place too. And I tell you what, I hate sort of deferring this, but the idea is that one of the things that I think is going to be significant about this film that's coming up is the idea that it's much easier to get a person to sit down and watch a movie than it is to read a book. That's a commitment to read a book. And if you've got a book that says, sensitive on it, or a sensitive man, like my book did, they're probably going to bristle at the idea of having to do that. I would take the same approach, though, that you would take uh, of working it into a conversation with them, uh, maybe talking about someone else who might have the trait, describing something like that. Because what you want to do is you're trying to reach out and get an anchor point with them so that you can have a more detailed conversation and get them interested into it. Like most people, they probably have this pejorative idea of what sensitivity is. They're zeroed in on the emotional meltdown or the emotional reactions and moodiness that they think that sensitive people inherently are and have. They're not understanding the rest of the trait, which is everything, I think, about this trait. The stuff that they see, this stuff that they consider to be negative, is really simply not understanding how to cope with the trait. That's it. That's all it is. The trait itself inherently is good. At least nature thought it was good, and it's kept it in the human population and in over 100 animal species as well. So it has some value to it. And that's the idea, is trying to get them lured into it. I hate the salesman type aspect of that, but the idea is that you've got to reach them where they're at and where they'll be receptive. Because if they are HSP and they're denying it, that's not going to do them any good.
It's so true. It really is about expanding this idea we have of sensitivity. Because I think so. Jacqueline talks about this a lot. Jacqueline Shirkland, who does the HSP retreats, about how when you are a balanced HSP, kind of more fade into the background a bit, versus the overwhelmed HSP who's very emotionally, um, emotions are just spilling off, on the surface, and you're not able to function as well as you'd like to, and all the good parts of the trait, all the positives are hidden and buried. But that makes it hard when we're having these conversations because people have lumped sensitivity in with emotionality, and not just emotionality but dysregulated emotionality, when
Exactly.
really that's just one small part of the trait. And when you're balanced and living a right lifestyle and you have community support, like going to your men's groups or going to the retreats, that starts to fade away, becomes the exception to the rule. um so yeah, it's really important to expand what people think of sensitivity is.
And that's the educational part of it. I think that's
Yeah.
where people need to understand fully what the trait is. And you're right, having support groups and stuff like that is very important to continue that good feeling about the trait itself. Uh, but there's a lot of education we have to do, and that unfortunately, good, bad, or indifferent. I happen to be indifferent about it. The term sensitive has got so many things attached to it that you're almost battling uphill just using the term. So if you feel comfortable using something else, use that. It's fine as long as you don't drift away from the attributes of the trait and the science underneath it. I think that you'll be fine talking to somebody even if they're resisting.
Yeah, and there's ways to find language that brings someone in versus pushing them away. Another question: how do you help HSP men to do less of that social comparison to other men who maybe aren't sensitive?
Yeah, that is a big thing. When we talked a little earlier about redefining masculinity, one of the things that I think a lot of people are afraid of when you bring up the term is like, well, once you open up the hood of the car, what's going to happen next? You're going to take everything out and restart over from the beginning. I don't think everything about masculinity is bad. As we have expressed, there's a lot of really good men out there who are not highly sensitive, and a lot of good men out there who are highly sensitive. So the idea is not to look at necessarily throwing everything out about masculinity, but expanding what a masculine definition can be for men. And again, I think I'll tell you what I really think down the road and in the future that at some point I'm wondering if gender identity becomes less and less important and being human becomes more and more important to us. Um, So, with men who are comparing themselves to other men, um, one of the things they're going to have to do is understand that they're really never going to be that sort of idealized Clint Eastwood, John Wayne kind of male, right? But that doesn't mean they have to disconnect from things that have been associated with masculinity in the past that they identify with, they're comfortable with. Maybe it's sports, maybe it's camping, fishing, doing things like that they like doing and would like to continue doing. But the real key is to understand where the delta is, where the difference is between them and these traditional men. And I think a lot of times you'll find that even these guys they compare themselves to, if you break down the exterior wall, they're nothing but little boys inside who are confused and lost about their masculinity as well. And I see that more and more and more, especially as I'm researching this book that I'm working on now about masculinity. So many men will confess at some point, whether they're HSP or not, that they don't get it and they don't relate to it, and it's hard to be that.
Yeah, it's very suffocating to be put in that box, for sure, for any men, for any male, not just highly sensitive men.
Exactly, exactly.
We have one final question. So someone's saying, I find sensitivity is antithetical to capitalism. So can we talk about how the culture that you're in dictates how your sensitivity is viewed and talked about? So different cultures are going to view sensitive people in different ways. And do you ever bring that in as part of the conversation?
Here, well, here's some things too. I can talk because I've lived in it. Western culture is something I'm familiar with, but I find that even in cultures, Eastern cultures, there is this thread of masculinity that runs true through that. I saw recently, in the last year or so, an article in the New York Times about the Chinese were cracking down on a group of actors, singers, whatever, in China who were androgynous. They said this is not good because it sort of effeminizes males and sort of the energy of the country, which is all BS. But it still highlights the idea that, and this is a country who is supposedly communist with a capitalist twist, and they're still operating from that hegemonic masculinity, toxic masculinity standpoint. So I think it really does permeate across lots of different cultures. You're right about capitalism. Capitalism is about eat or be eaten. It's about competition, not cooperation. High sensitivity, I think, is more empathetic towards the idea of cooperation, the idea of working together. Um, I guess you could have debate after debate from sociological and anthropological reasons whether competition or cooperation is the natural way for humans. I happen to believe that cooperation is more natural for humans. Competition maybe took hold after the agricultural age took hold and people could accumulate wealth because they're stationary. So, without going into a political discussion about that, we live where we live. We work within the context of the government and the kind of society that we support here. I think the idea that we can still live in a capitalist society um, that has sort of that cooperative element to it that takes the edges off of it, the spikes off of it, makes it a little more palatable to everybody. And if you can make it equitable, you got it wired, right? The
Yeah.
idea that always the biggest fish eats all the other fish is not really a very good survival strategy, I don't think.
Hmm. Yeah. Thank you for bringing that, for everyone for bringing that as part of the conversation, because we are impacted by the culture that we live in and by the expectations of that culture. And yeah, there is a need to find out how we can be our full sensitive selves in that culture, especially as men, and breaking free of the limitations of that. So, Bill, we're out of time for today. I just want to thank you so much for being here with us, for sharing your insights and your wisdom. And just as a reminder, if folks want to contact you, the best places to visit your website.
That's right. The website's a good place to
Yeah,
start.
great. I'll put that in the chat. I'll also be sending out your information about your books and your group, and other resources by email tomorrow, along with this recording.
Fantastic. It's been a real pleasure. It's been an honor to talking to you and
Same.
all these fine folks.
Yeah, thank you all for being here and for sharing in the chat and asking questions. It's been really wonderful to be in conversation.